A warm welcome, everyone, to the Ethics and Society stage at this year's 2021 CogX Hybrid Festival. My name is Andrew Straight. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and for the purpose of today, one of your MCs for the stage. It will be my job to introduce and close each session, highlight what's coming up next for you on the stage, and share the occasional AI-based dad joke to help, reinforce your learning. I'm sorry. For those who don't know us, Ada is a London-based research and deliberative body with an independently funded basis with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. We're so excited to once again sponsor this year's event on ethics and society, where we'll discuss several crucial technology ethics issues. We're excited to provide you with an exciting lineup for this day, a discussion centered on a range of topics, including biometric technologies, the future of social media regulation, the use of vaccine and health passports, healthcare inequalities caused by COVID, and the effectiveness of corporate ethics research initiatives. And there are so many more fantastic events that will be happening on this stage over the next 2 days, which include things like diversity in tech, the future of AI, what we mean by good data and good outcomes, practicing anti-racism in AI research, and something I think many of us can relate to, how we can stop the doom scrolling that I think many of us have been doing over the last few months. This is just a smattering of the events that are happening across CogX this week, and you can find a full agenda on the cogx.live website or via the CogX app. A few housekeeping bits before we introduce our first session. First, this is a hybrid festival. So throughout the next 3 days, CogX will have sessions that will be in person, some part in person and part virtual, and fully virtual. You can find the information on which are which on the CogX agenda and the CogX app. Our discussions today are not just virtual lectures. We do want to hear from you. So there will be an opportunity to provide question and answer at the end of each panel for about 10 to 15 minutes. You can do so by placing your questions in the chat, and the CogX team will surface it to the moderator. We do encourage you to ask constructive questions, but please be aware that CogX does have a code of conduct available on its website, which explains what behavior is and isn't appropriate in the event sessions and the process by which any bad behavior can be reported. Now, if you're a social media influencer, aspiring or actual, you can tweet your thoughts, feelings, and questions at hashtag CogX2021. There is currently no TikTok hashtag at the moment, but please do start one. We will happily support you in that venture. If you like what a speaker has to say, you can visit the CogX online bookshop, which features works from various speakers on stage. You can find that by searching CogX Bookshop in the Hop-In Expo. Excellent. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our first panel on the topic of vaccine passports and the next generation of digital infrastructure. As the pandemic response moves into vaccine distribution, we're seeing certification and health status applications offered as a promising digital tool to enable freedoms. This panel will get into the questions of what those risks are with these kinds of technologies, what the challenges these technologies pose are, and how we can use these technologies responsibly. This panel will be moderated by Imogen Parker, Associate Director of Policy at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So I want to thank you so much again for joining, and Imogen, I'll hand it to you.
Good morning and welcome to this first session of the Ada Lovelace curated Ethics and Society stage on vaccine passports. It's a really great topic to kick off the day and the festival with, getting, I think, to the heart of some really thorny questions about technology and data's role in society. So by way of intro, vaccine passports, we're using that term as an umbrella term to cover the sorts of technologies we've seen evolving that bring together health status, vaccines or testing, identity information, and verification by a third party to allow or permit something. And that might be borders, that might be pubs, that might be entrance to festivals and events. Vaccine passports have really been on the agenda since early on in the pandemic. At Ada, we've been looking at this since April last year. And there's been different waves of interest from companies and from countries. Very early on, there was tools thinking about natural immunity. There was a second wave of interest when we got reliable antibody tests. But things have really felt like they're taking off in this third wave now when we've got vaccines coming on stream. And we're seeing a number of tools rolled out across the globe. We're seeing a lot of interest at European level. We're seeing a lot of very polemicized, I think, debate in the UK about this topic. Advocates say that building these technologies could help society open up safer and sooner by allowing a more granular sense of risk, allowing people who are lower risk to go about their daily lives, get the economy moving, and get us away from those really damaging mass lockdowns. But fears have been raised about creating emergency infrastructure that might stick around, built on evolving and uncertain science that is fundamentally, in some way, about discrimination at an individual level about health status. And it's really important we dig into those potential benefits, those potential harms in advance of any of these sorts of tools. So to get stuck into this topic, I've got two absolutely phenomenal speakers. We have Linnet Taylor, who is Associate Professor at Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society in the Netherlands. And her research has been focusing on digital data, representation, democracy, with particular attention to transnational governance issues. She's also been leading the Global Data Justice Project, which aims to develop a social justice-informed framework for governance of data technologies at the global level. We also have James Wilson, who is Professor of Philosophy at UCL, University College London, where he's also co-director of the Health Humanities Centre. He's co-investigator with the UK Pandemic Ethics Accelerator, a member of the National Data Guardians Panel, of the Faculty of Public Health Ethics Committee, and was a member of the Ethics Advisory Group for the NHS COVID-19 app. So we are so grateful to have you both with us today. Perhaps we should start by just laying out the landscape for people that haven't been following this evolution quite as closely. I wonder if, Linnet, you could kick us off in just painting a bit of a picture about the sorts of tools or approaches we're seeing around the world. Where's countries of interest? Where should we be looking?
Sure. Thanks, Imogen. So I guess the main place that we're looking when we think of ready-to-go vaccine certification systems is probably the EU. We're seeing the Green Pass being developed, somewhat on the model of Israel's, which was in play because they got vaccinated the earliest. In terms of international scale, it's mostly the most vaccinated countries that are thinking about basically how to control movement from less vaccinated countries. So we're looking at high-income countries as the major procurers of this tech, whatever that means at this point. The WHO issued guidelines back in 2020 for private companies to bid to create a worldwide system for certifying vaccination. That is not in place yet. And so we're seeing regional efforts and national efforts. We should also be aware that there are going to be a lot of private sector efforts on the more local level that will feed into businesses' efforts to certify people as safe to come to the office, for instance. And events organizers will also be using these systems. They may or may not link up with national systems and international ones. That is not clear yet. So we're seeing a bunch of different levels on which this is playing out. And it's still very early days to understand which systems may be more functional than others and what exactly the effects of these systems will be. We can only hypothesize at this point. But generally, they're being, as you say, constructed to discriminate between people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. And they are generally being built to keep out citizens of countries which are less vaccinated countries.
That's great, thank you. And are there dominant models emerging, or at this stage, is it more just different countries are taking different approaches? Are they starting to converge around certain approaches?
At the moment, it seems like it's a bit of a free-for-all. It's not entirely clear what the WHO is going to come up with. Maybe James has more insight on that than me, but it's clear that this will be built in stages and that there will be travel certification between high-income countries in place long before we know what the entire system, whatever that is going to look like on the global level.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, James, I think a lot of the debate around this has been from the perspective of ethics and impact on society. Before we've seen countries like Germany commission independent ethics reviews on this, and I think, have a lot of back and forth about where this should go. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of an introductory sense of the sorts of ethical terms or frameworks or debates that really arise when you think about something like a vaccine passport.
Sure, thank you. So I think that whenever we're thinking about introducing a new technology, there are various sort of obvious and central questions that we have to ask. First of all, what's it for? What's it trying to achieve? Second thing is the aim of it a good one? Is it something that's in the public interest? Is it something that enjoys general support? Next, is this technology actually necessary to achieve that aim? Are there ways of achieving that aim that could be equally good or better? And last, you can ask, is that technology proportionate as a way of attaining that aims, do the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms? And so that won't just be a matter of thinking of we should add things up, but rather think about, are there particular reasons to think that this technology may have effects on vulnerable groups? And that one of the reasons why vaccine passports has been so ethically contentious is that there are basically two different ways of framing them from an ethical perspective. On the one hand, you could think them as it were, as a passport to freedom, as a way of allowing us to get from a situation where everyone's freedoms are curtailed in problematic ways to ones in which at least a good proportion of the population are able to do more, which then might be connected to increased economic activity and various other sorts of things. But alternatively, you could focus on the people who are excluded, the people who are unable to do the things that some other people are then able to do. And you might be particularly worried if that increases inequalities that you see in society. Particularly as most people are well aware that there may be clustering of vaccine hesitancy around particular ethnic groups or particular religions, in which case it may amount to a form of indirect discrimination if you then build a system which you know will significantly disadvantage people from certain groups in society.
That's great. And as we're looking around the world, are there very different kind of ethical schools of thought that make this more palatable, less palatable? Are there kind of different frameworks that need to be thought about in terms of making those trade-offs or answering those questions?
I think that the major fault lines across the world in this are really about how much people trust the state, how much confidence do people have in the state to build large-scale data infrastructures that will combine information about their identity with biometric details about their health status. And that in societies like the US, where people are generally pretty suspicious about the idea of the state taking on a large role in building big infrastructures, and people have been very much against them, and possibly in Israel, where maybe people are much more comfortable with the idea of a security state already, it was much easier to set up the Green Pass system. And maybe in the EU, you see that in a way, sort of juggling between sort of common values of the EU around solidarity and freedom of movement, but at the same time thinking, well, how can we get this moving again? So that I think in many ways you've seen sort of a set of similar sorts of questions about balancing civil liberties, privacy versus freedom, economic activity, but just different countries and regions responding to those, according to the way that they weigh up those values.
That's great, and I'm really glad you raised that question of the state, because something I'd love to get a bit deeper in is how this plays out differently if it feels like it's state or government led versus private actor led or company led. I've got some questions I'd love to get into. In terms of the audience, if they want to share Q&As, I'll also be keeping an eye on that. I'll make sure we have some time at the end, but do feel free to start throwing those in, and I'll keep a check on that. So kind of a question for you both. I wonder why, firstly, let's think about the benefits for this. This all over the world, different countries have been looking at this. We've seen a lot of rhetoric around it for at least a year. What do you think people hope the benefits will be? And then I'd love to get the chance to dig into the risks. Linnet, do you want to kick us off on?
That's a great question. I think considerations of the kind of cost-benefit analysis that James was just talking about, and the more general idea of, is this a good idea per se, they really change according to the scale of your considerations. So if you're looking within the UK, which is, compared to the world, a fairly homogeneous environment, it's possible that you can consider these advantages and disadvantages rationally and with evidence. And that it might come out that, yes, on some level, it's a good idea to have these in place for some people some of the time under certain circumstances. When you broaden out the scale of considerations, you start seeing questions like solidarity amongst whom on the global scale, in aid of what on the global scale, and it gets much more complicated to say what is beneficial and what is not. We're going to see that different health systems, for instance, including within countries, in more unequal countries such as the US, are going to produce certifications that are more or less readable by whatever international system we wind up with. So if, for instance, you're getting vaccinated by a doctor in rural India or Africa, you will be just as vaccinated as the people on this call are but you will be infinitely less likely to be able to prove that in a stable way. And this is going to introduce a layer of administration to mobility around the world that will be permanent, because these systems are not going anywhere, and that is not correctable in the way that data can be on the local level. If you take my information for a census and you say that I'm a man who is 70 years old and I work in an agricultural enterprise, then I can probably call up someone and say, this is clearly nonsense. It's in both of our interests that you change that. If a system doesn't recognize my doctor's certification that she has vaccinated me, who I go to get that changed is very uncertain. And that applies whether I'm British, whether I'm Indian, whether I'm from Fiji, it doesn't matter. It's going to be very hard for the person reading the certification to be nuanced about whether that person is really certified or not. And this is going to be massively problematic. I will pass to James at this point.
Interesting. I guess the question was about what are the benefits of this, and maybe I should try to say a bit more about what the people think of the potential benefits. So I guess in thinking about the potential benefits, you have to think about what the alternatives would be. So it seems to me that, well, if you think of a vaccine passport as an alternative to lockdown, then it might seem quite attractive, at least to many of those people who have already been vaccinated, who think that they'd be happy to show some credentials in order to get their life back or to be able to go on holiday to other countries. And I was thinking about the current UK border regime, where we have a system at the moment where that there's about sort of 4 places in the world that you're allowed to go to, which are on the green list, and most of those places are places that you aren't actually allowed to go to if you're British anyway, like Iceland, or you can go to the Falkland Islands if you want to. But nearly all the countries in the world are either on the amber list or the red list, meaning that when you come back, you'll have to by law quarantine for 14 days. But it seems that a vaccine passport could potentially solve that problem in a way that would be introduce no additional risk if, as it were, the government was able to certify that you've had both, fully vaccinated, you're able to go to a country which will accept that certificate, and then when you come back, you wouldn't need an additional period of quarantine just because all the certification has been done at international level. I think that's what people are hoping for, and certainly I think that many people would think that as an attractive proposition if it's a question about either not being able to leave the UK to go on holiday at all this year or for the foreseeable future, or as we have to take a vaccination passport with them when they go to Spain or France. I think many people would see that as a good trade, and so that I think that's what the government might think of as a good thing about it. I think that all the things that Linnet mentioned will also be downsides about it. But I just want to say that I can see that there are reasons why people might think it was attractive.
And what about then digging into, I mean, Linnet's already raised a few, but digging into some of the risks around this. And I also particularly wondered, are those risks magnified when you're talking about domestic use? Is it more straightforward if we keep it as about international travel? Just wanted some thoughts on what should we make sure doesn't happen, or why might these not be good for people and society?
Yeah. On the domestic level, I think they're really quite problematic, because there's maybe one important question would be, well, when do you attempt to introduce the certification regime at a domestic level? Because if you do it before all adults have had a chance to be vaccinated, then it looks clearly discriminatory, particularly if it's going to prevent people going to do things that are really important to them, whether it be able to attend their church or take part in activities with their friends. So it looks like it would be clearly discriminatory to do that. But at the same time, by the time you vaccinated, or at least offered the opportunity to all adults to be vaccinated, then you're likely to have a very high level of vaccination in the country anyway. And so there might be much less need for the vaccine passport. I have a feeling that's what the government in the UK is sort of wrestling with at the moment, having sort of talked it up. I suspect we may get an announcement today that at best that vaccine passports are going to play a pretty marginal role, so that maybe if we're going to football clubs or nightclubs, but nothing very much else, because it seems that by the time to get to a certain point where everybody's had the opportunity to be vaccinated, it's not really clear what the additional public health benefit would be, and certainly it may not outweigh the risks. But I can see that they may be here to stay for international travel, but for domestic travel, they don't seem to be particularly useful. And it's notable that Israel has recently withdrawn its green pass, having been the first country to introduce it. They basically decommissioned it and decided that, well, the case rates are low enough, the vaccination rate is high enough, we don't really need this anymore.
So perhaps either discriminatory or not very useful. Maybe that's too glib, but it would be interesting to know if they do get rolled out for international travel, or as we start to see countries use these, will they become an inevitability? Will they get pulled back, or are they here to stay? And I think it's very interesting to see Israel step back away from that. Linnet, have you got any thoughts about potentially what some of the medium or longer term futures might be of these tools as we start to see countries adopt them?
Yeah, I mean, I think what James just said about this being seen as an alternative to lockdown is both the most powerful statement about why these vaccination certification programs are happening, and something that we need to unpack a little. Because, so for instance, the Tony Blair Institute has a very powerful voice in this debate, saying this is so that we don't have any more lockdowns. But the freedom to cross borders and to be vaccinated and certified for that is not the same as the pandemic going away. There is absolutely no connection between certifying people as vaccinated and getting rid of the pandemic, right? This is not an alternative to lockdown. I don't believe James meant to say that, but I'm hearing, for instance, the Tony Blair Institute saying that very, very clearly, that if you don't want lockdown, you have to consent to the installation of massive technological infrastructures of identification that are new, that will be permanent, and that will be used for other purposes as well. What is the alternative to lockdown is sustained public health measures that prevent the occurrence of new variants in particular, which includes, and to do that, we need to vaccinate people all around the planet in a meaningful way, really fast. We're not doing that. That's an alternative to lockdown, because eventually new variants will come and get us even through our barrier of vaccines. This is one pretty much certainty, is that vaccine status will become less relevant the more people around the planet keep catching COVID, because there will be more and more variants, and these will eventually, unfortunately, penetrate the barrier of vaccination. And so there are all sorts of things we can do that we need to do to prevent lockdown, none of which involve having a really nice, expensive technical infrastructure to let people go on holiday. Even though that's a nice thing, I'm in favor of going on holiday. I would love to go on holiday myself. However, combating the pandemic is an entirely different question, and I'm worried that we're conflating these two things.
And I think it must be at the point we're starting to roll out these tools, it's the same time you're getting mass vaccination. So to try and detangle the impact of those two things must be very difficult.
Well, we're getting mass vaccination in a really small minority of countries.
Sorry, absolutely.
And in the rest of the world, the vaccines are not rolling out meaningfully, and the virus is continuing to circulate. And where people have worse health status in the first place, they have the disease for longer, and new variants are more likely to arise. So the populations that we hear about producing variants, like the Brits, are not actually the populations we need to worry about most. It's the ones that are not getting vaccinated at all. Yeah. So the notion that we are doing okay is I think not intensely helpful in thinking about the pros and cons of this system.
Absolutely. And I mean, just going a bit further on to that, Linnet, I know you've described this as immunity certification theatre. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that, about kind of what you mean by that phrase, and why you're characterizing it as that. I think it's a really interesting phrase.
Well, we talk about border theatre and border security theatre. Do you remember when we all had to take our, well, we still do have to take our shoes off to go through an airport, when we have to take all of the liquids out of our bag to go through airport security checks? There is some meaning to this, because people have blown up planes using things that were concealed in their shoes and in liquids. However, this is the previous problem. And so what this is security theatre about the previous problem, to make people feel okay about traveling and to make it clear that authorities are doing something about security. This is one function of authority. We need that to happen. However, when it happens at the expense of actually doing something about security, then we worry. And I would compare that with what's going on with vaccine certification right now. This idea that if we do this, then the pandemic will decrease its prevalence, that we can get out of a lockdown situation, that we will be less at risk from the pandemic. the performance of creating the tech and certifying people is very different from the process of vaccinating everybody and of continuing to socially distance and of continuing to persuade people to wear masks and take precautions. That is the untheatrical, annoying reality of the pandemic that we're not engaging with when we're doing the theater of discussing whether we should or shouldn't have a QR code on our phones. And as James correctly pointed out, questions of solidarity are absolutely central here. And in fact, this theater tends to distract from the actual solidarity that we need to build, because these are different and separate ways of building a public conversation about this. One is about individual freedom, letting people travel on holiday, letting people go to events. The other is about acknowledging that we're still in the midst of a global pandemic and actually working together to stop that. And these are almost mutually exclusive, unfortunately.
James, would you agree with that characterization? Is when it comes to the risks and the harms, is this very much an individualistic tool that might cut against more solidaristic measures? And I guess public health is fundamentally quite a solidaristic set of measures.
I think basically, yes, there may be ways of using and deploying vaccine certification that isn't quite so individualistic, but it seems that all the use cases that people keep telling us about, the idea of people going to nightclubs or doing activities that otherwise would be too unwise or too risky to do, or foreign travel, a lot of those seem to be about focusing on the privileges of relatively wealthy individuals. But that, I mean, one thing I think it's worth thinking about and stepping back from is about just the sheer importance of public health surveillance as part of the response. And so that maybe we need to say a little bit more about sort of what's good data gathering by the state, what's bad data gathering by the state. And so that I think, as the health data research, such as in the UK often say, data saves lives. And in this particular case, they're obviously correct. And it's largely the more sort of public health data you have at your fingertips as a government, the more that you can do in order to understand the spread of disease and various other sorts of elements about it. So I don't think we should be too squeamish about the idea of the state gathering public health intelligence in order to help the fight against COVID. But I mean, the question is, well, is what we're doing through vaccine certification a particularly useful way of extending that public health project more generally? And for the reasons we've been discussing, and maybe it isn't a particularly good method for it, but I don't think we should just throw our hands up and say, well, we shouldn't allow the state to become any more powerful. It may only be by the state gathering more information that it's able to actually get us to a state where COVID is properly suppressed.
And in an earlier iteration of pandemic technologies that lots of countries have adopted was around contact tracing apps. I wonder are there any similarities in the sorts of debates, challenges, risks, benefits with that wave of pandemic technology when it comes to vaccine passports? James, I know that's something you looked closely at. Yeah,
I think there's both similarities and differences. So that, I mean, one thing that the system we settled on, sort of as it was sponsored by Apple and Google, is much more decentralized than anything you could possibly do for vaccine certification, because the whole idea of vaccine or immunity certification is you have to be able to tie some description of when somebody's been vaccinated with their identity, so that by its very nature it involves a massive amount of personal information about individuals, whereas the system that was built eventually for the COVID apps was one in which was decentralized, and because of the way that the Bluetooth contact proximity testing worked, you could do it in a way that was much more privacy preserving. So that there's that dissimilarity. I mean, having said that, I mean, what we've now seen after sort of many months of COVID apps is I'm beginning to wonder whether we actually made the wrong sort of decision, because at the time a lot of the debate was about, well, we definitely need a decentralized system because of all these dangers of the state infrastructure. But I think that those apps could have been a lot more effective had they been centralized. It was largely because of a certain engineering decision taken by Apple and Google, but the NHS sort of gave up on the attempt to build a centralized app. But I wouldn't be surprised if we could have saved several thousand more lives had we had a more centralized app and been able to launch that in a way that maintained public trust. And so that I think in all these cases there are going to be trade-offs, and the idea that somehow that you can protect privacy to the largest degree while fighting disease is not always true.
Linnet, do you see that some countries have held those tensions well, have managed some of those risks, or have thought carefully about the way you've seen technology evolving, or especially in the midst of a pandemic, have we seen a bit of a rush to technology to try and solve all our problems? Yeah, I wondered if anyone's kind of getting this right at the moment.
So that is the question. This is actually quite hard to call at the moment, because if you'd asked me this question 6 months ago, I would say that a lot of Southeast Asian countries have been showing the world how to do this a little better, and that they've actually done it in line with what James just said, that they've centralized more, they've created more public trust around that centralization, and they've also enforced a lot more. And this is not to fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, Asian countries like authoritarianism, because this is not true. They like not having thousands and thousands of deaths from the pandemic, and they're very clear about that. We have not been as clear about that. We've had a lot of other discussions which have misled us. And one has been about the trade-off between privacy and public health. This is a much more complicated debate than we can get into in the next 5 minutes. But I think it's a massive red herring, and I think James might agree with me on the key points about this. That it's very hard to find people that agree that we should keep the pandemic running in order to prevent centralizing health data, because we already centralize most of the important data about ourselves. We're just used to it. We're not used to this, and so this has come with a wave of fear about tech and about centralization of information that is not necessarily justified. I think it is useful to look at the example of Southeast Asian countries which have had less than 1,000 deaths in general. They've done extraordinarily well, even though they are massive trading centers. They have a lot of mobility, just like the UK, just like chunks of Europe and the US. They have managed to combat it much better than us. And they've done it as well through actually supporting people and checking that people are isolating. What we haven't had is an infrastructure to support the entire trajectory of what happens when somebody is suspected of having COVID. We have some nice apps that ping when you've been within 15 minutes within a couple of meters of someone who's reported to have COVID. What we don't have is any follow-up on that. We don't have humans in the mix to call you up and say, have you got tested? Would you like to get tested? Can we help you get tested? And then to call you up and say, oh, you tested positive. Can we help you out with self-isolation? Can we bring you groceries? Will you get fired if you isolate at this point? We've had none of that. And all the discussion has been about the tech, which is absolutely insane. So if we decenter the technology a little bit, we might find that there are more lessons to follow than we think.
I think that's such great points and so crucial. We've heard a lot of overly simplistic and just false binary positions on some of this stuff, which absolutely don't need to be the case. And we've actually done a small amount of public deliberation, and they don't see this as, public health versus privacy. There's real questions about just, would it work to start with? Is this a legitimate thing I should trust? If I'm going to drag my kid out of nursery for 2 weeks and have them at home in these 4 walls, is that legitimate? And so I think both getting beyond some of those false binary positions and also making sure we're thinking about the systems, not just the bit of tech that, as you say, often attracts a lot of focus, and it needs focus. You have to get the tech right, but we also have to get the entire socio-technical system that
it's also important to say, sorry, Imogen, that if you get it wrong, it's highly noticeable. So to agree with what you said, of course we need to get the tech right, but there's nothing wrong with having the tech. We keep getting the social bit wrong. Sorry.
No, that's a great line. We've got about just under 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to encourage the audience, if anybody does have any burning questions for this panel, do put them in and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So really getting into some of the kind of going beyond just the tech in this, which is absolutely not just what we need to do for COVID tech, but I think a lot of these tools can have value, but it's about the system they're embedded into. I wondered whether there are steps that companies could be taking to try and minimize some of the harms and maximize some of the benefits or around this, given that they can't be in control of the whole system that we know would need to be in line to make sure these are beneficial. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about what companies should be doing or designers of these systems should be doing to get this right.
I think that maybe one thing that all companies need to be able to think through, especially those who might be thinking of deploying such systems. So we're aware that sort of Pimlico Plumbers and one or two other companies have announced that they want to do some kind of testing of vaccination of people before either taking them on or continuing to employ them. Is that anybody who's thinking of using vaccine certification in a domestic context needs to be really careful that they've thought through the ethical implications of that. What are the implications for equality on that? What happens when you have staff members who genuinely are vaccine hesitant, who maybe have a conscientious objection to it? Effectively, are you going to dismiss them from their jobs? It seems that such a really difficult set of questions that are hidden by the mere, the apparently sort of big sort of PR piece saying, yes, we're going to make it safer for our customers. We're going to ensure that all of our operatives are vaccinated, and that I think that there needs to be much more public debate about that. Maybe one thing that companies could do by way of leadership would be to say, well, we'll never use vaccine certification in this kind of a way to show leadership on it, because that insofar as you move towards a sort of a set of infrastructures where it becomes embedded within hiring decisions, that people need to show sort of some kind of vaccine certification, then it'd be quite difficult to undo that. And it seems quite obvious to lead to that it may risk leading to forms of indirect discrimination. So I think that companies at least have a good and important negative role in not getting on getting on this bus.
And I think a lot of people have suggested that incorporation, if you can incorporate testing, that's a way to actually mitigate some of the biggest discriminatory risks. I wondered what you thought about that. It seems like many countries are aspiring to incorporate testing. I think incorporating testing brings a whole set of practical and operational headaches in terms of building that in quickly and effectively. But do you see that as minimizing some of the discrimination risks?
I think that basically, yes. There's a question there about what happens if people also want to object to the idea of being regularly tested, as some people in Israel did, either because it seems disproportionate or because they just object to the idea of people having that kind of information about them. I think at that point you are going to face a set of questions about sort of what it's legitimate for employers to ask, or what is legitimate to governments to allow employers to ask about those who are being employed. And so there hasn't really been very much discussion about that in the context of whether of education or healthcare in the UK so far. It's just been assumed that it's legitimate to do so because it would be beneficial. It may be that you get to a certain point about if cases drop to a certain degree, you may think, well, is this now disproportionate? But certainly, on the surface, it looks like a way of trying to solve the problem in a way that sort of requires less building of permanent data infrastructure, is easier to dismantle, is potentially at least sort of less violating of individual privacy. So it looks like a better way to go than building a system of certification merely for the purposes of employment.
Do you agree, Linnet? And in those countries you've been looking at where, mass vaccination is a long way off, are these tools gaining traction around testing as the primary vehicle for deciding whether people are higher risk or lower risk?
Well, I wish we could say that testing was further along as well. I mean, I think to some extent the capacity to test goes along with the capacity to vaccinate. You need resources. And we're talking about countries with lower resources not being able to mount an effective response to the pandemic. So that's the larger problem. I agree with what James just said, and I would add to that sunset clauses for all of these tech deployments are super important, because we simply don't know yet what the private sector response is really going to look like, what the implications will be for employee monitoring in the future, what the implications are currently for privacy and individual rights. I think we can't call it yet. And I think it's asking a lot of people like the three people on this call to try to set out guidelines and frameworks and help people understand what's going to happen next, because it's not in place yet. And the main weapon that we have is state regulation of not just the tech, but of the private sector per se, and not treating them as if they were completely independent agents when they're dealing with the majority of the population as employees. and also just sunset clauses so that we can look at technology in a rational way and understand whether it is benefiting or, causing disadvantages for people at large. So we need a better discussion about where there are problems and about how to switch from bad tech to good tech. And I think that setting that up right now is realistic, whereas setting up the final framework for how that should be done is not.
That takes me beautifully on to a kind of closing question for you both, which is around what governments should be doing right now when they are looking at other countries adopting some of these tools. They are getting examples and I suppose pitches and some private sector actors moving ahead with this. What role for government, what steps would they be taking, should they be taking now in terms of this? Perhaps James, if you want to kick us off, and any other closing thoughts.
So I guess the thing that government should be doing is maybe pretty much what the UK government has been doing, trying to collect information on, think about it. Is there a case? So I mentioned right at the beginning, some basic question about, well, if we introduce this technology, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Getting clear about that question, thinking about, well, is it necessary? Would it be proportionate? I think that each government needs to be able to work through those questions when thinking about some vaccine certification, and think about, well, what's the use case for us? And that if you're in a country which either is very dependent on tourism, or one in which you're less well along with the vaccination than the UK, then there may be a use case for it insofar as you can see that it would allow economic activity to continue in various sorts of ways while keeping the disease, if not at bay, then at least within manageable levels, and that might be a good thing for certain countries given where they are. But that insofar as your country like the UK, where it seems that you already have a pretty high level of vaccination, and that also I think it'd be unthinkable for the UK government to try and introduce it, as it were, anything like vaccine certifications on a big scale before all adults have been vaccinated. But then after that, you have this weird sense of everybody's had this what the government would describe as kind of freedom, and then you want to row back from that and saying, well, we're now introducing these passports in the winter. I can't see it being a very easy sell, and so maybe all governments have to be able to think about the sequencing, and there may be moments for within that trajectory where you think, well, yes, this might be a useful moment where we could use a vaccine passport, at least in theory. Whereas I think it may be that the UK may have passed that at a domestic level, apart from very specific use cases, even though we may be at a place where, at an international level, that may still be useful for years to come.
Fantastic. Linnet, what are your thoughts on what governments should or shouldn't be doing to close?
So I agree with James, and I would build on that to say that unless we're thinking of this as a planetary problem and as a foreign policy problem as well as a domestic policy problem, the domestic answers that we come up with are not going to be meaningful. So I think that governments need to think hard about how to work on two tracks, one of which is visible to their local electorate, and one of which is not, but is actually more important by far. Because the one lesson we can take from trying to combat the pandemic so far is that if a new variant comes through that is powerful enough, it really doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're being successful on the local level or not. And so we need people to think about what's going on within countries, but if we don't think about what's going on between them, then that doesn't really matter.
Fantastic. Really great closing thoughts and a really great first session. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you to the audience for joining us as well. I'm going to leave it there and pass back to my colleague, Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Imogen, James, and Linnet. That was a fantastic opening panel to the ADA sponsored stage, a sponsored portion today of the Ethics and Society stage. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break. Go outside, stand in the sun, look up at it. Don't stare too long. Get a tea, get some water. We'll be back at 11 o'clock for a discussion around the future of biometrics technologies with Julie Dawson from Yoti, Matthew Ryder from QC, and my colleague Aidan Pepin from ADA.